Tab 1. In the spring of 2021, a 52-year-old woman named Karen Davis was living her best life in Texas. She had just gotten married to the love of her life, and after a beautiful ceremony and a wonderful honeymoon, she was ready to begin this exciting new chapter. Like many newly married people, one of the first things she wanted to do was change her last name. She wanted to officially transition from Karen Davis to Karen McBride to match her husband. It was a simple, exciting step that symbolized her new beginning. So she went through the necessary legal channels, and once the initial paperwork was approved, the very last step was to get a new driver's license reflecting her new name. Karen went online and emailed the local Department of Motor Vehicles to schedule an appointment. But almost immediately after she sent that email, she received a reply that stopped her in her tracks. The DMV told her that they could not process her request. In fact, they said they could not help her with anything at all until she resolved an outstanding issue. The email did not explain what the issue was. Instead, it cryptically mentioned that it had something to do with the state of Oklahoma, and at the bottom of the email, they provided a single phone number she needed to call. Karen was extremely confused, but she used to live in Oklahoma, so she figured it was probably just some old, unresolved paperwork or maybe an unpaid parking ticket. She decided to get it over with, so she dialed the number. Within seconds, a woman answered, but it was not the DMV. It was the district attorney's office in Norman, Oklahoma. Karen assumed they had given her the wrong number, but she explained her situation anyway. She told the woman that she was just trying to get a new driver's license in Texas, but they told her there was some kind of hold on her name from Oklahoma. The employee on the other end took Karen's information and did a quick search on her computer. When she found the file, she paused and asked Karen if she was sitting down. Then she explained what the issue was. For the last 22 years, Karen had been a wanted felon. Hearing this, Karen was completely stunned. She had never been arrested, she had never committed a crime, and she was a law-abiding citizen. But as the woman read the details, everything in Karen's life suddenly started to make sense. You see, for over 2 decades, Karen had faced an incredibly difficult time finding and keeping a job. Despite being highly educated, articulate, and having excellent references, she would apply for positions she was overqualified for and get rejected. On the rare occasions she did get hired, she would be fired shortly after starting, usually with no real explanation. She had spent 22 years feeling like a failure, doubting her own abilities and struggling to make ends meet, never knowing why she was constantly being rejected. She would sit at her kitchen table, looking at rejection letter after rejection letter, crying and wondering what was wrong with her. She had no idea that behind the scenes, a standard background check was flagging her as a high-risk fugitive wanted for felony embezzlement. It turned out that back in 1999, when she was living in Norman, Oklahoma, she had a roommate who had young children. One weekend, the roommate wanted to watch a movie with his kids, so he went to a local video rental store called Movie Place. He used Karen's membership card to rent the popular 90s television movie Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but when the weekend was over, the roommate forgot to return the VHS tape. The store was called Movie Place, and it was a popular local spot for families in Norman. Karen's roommate had promised his children a fun weekend movie night, so he borrowed Karen's rental card. This card was linked directly to Karen's name and her address. When the roommate selected Sabrina the Teenage Witch, he checked it out under her account. But as the days turned into weeks, the tape remained sitting on top of their television set, completely forgotten. The rental store did not just let this go. To them, unreturned tapes were a major loss of inventory, but they also represented a potential source of income from late fees. However, when the fees accumulated and the tape was still not returned, the store management decided to take an extreme step. Instead of simply sending the account to a collection agency, which is what most stores did, they contacted the local police department and filed a formal complaint for felony embezzlement. They claimed that the cardholder had intentionally stolen their property. Because Karen moved out of the apartment and out of the state of Oklahoma shortly after, she never received any mail, phone call, or legal notices about the warrant. For over 2 decades, she lived her life in complete ignorance of the fact that she was considered a fugitive. She went about her daily life, worked hard, paid her taxes, and tried to build a career, all while this invisible black mark was completely destroying her professional reputation. When employers ran background checks, the system flagged her as a wanted felon, and because of this, they immediately rejected her applications or let her go. Karen immediately worked with the district attorney's office in Norman to resolve this absurd misunderstanding. They went through the old records, saw that the video rental store had long since gone out of business, and realized the injustice of the situation. Finally, after 22 years of confusion and career struggles, the charges were officially dismissed, and Karen was able to get her new driver's license with her new husband's name. Let us move to the next story, which takes us to the early evening hours of December 24th, 2011, which was Christmas Eve. A 26-year-old woman named Zazel Preston was sitting on her bed in her small apartment in Anaheim, California. The room was quiet, lit only by a bedside lamp, and the floor was covered in rolls of festive wrapping paper, scissors, and tape. Zazel was busy wrapping holiday gifts for her children, trying to make sure everything was perfect for the next morning. Lying right next to her on the mattress was the newest addition to her family, a tiny 7-week-old baby boy who was sleeping soundly. This holiday season was incredibly important to Zazel. It was not just because she was celebrating her first Christmas with her newborn son, but also because it marked a major turning point in her marriage. Her husband was a 30-year-old man named William Wallace. The couple had been married for 3 years, but their relationship had been incredibly toxic, volatile, and physically abusive. They had separated multiple times, with police being called to their home on several occasions. But earlier that year, when Zazel found out she was pregnant with their son, they decided to reconcile. They made a solemn promise to put their volatile past behind them and create a stable, loving home for their newborn baby and Zazel's 2 older daughters, who were 3 and 8 years old. They wanted to give their children a peaceful, happy childhood, and this Christmas was supposed to be the start of that new life. After finishing up the wrapping, Zazel picked up her baby boy and walked into the living room. She met up with William and her daughters, and together, the family walked next door to attend a holiday party hosted by their neighbors. The party was filled with laughter, music, and holiday cheer. Neighbors would later recall seeing Zazel smiling, holding her baby, and looking genuinely happy. But when they returned to their apartment later that night, the fragile peace shattered. A massive, violent argument broke out between Zazel and William. As the children slept in their bedrooms, the fight turned physically violent. William's deep-seated anger and history of abuse boiled over. Neighbors would later report hearing loud, crashing noises, heavy thuds against the walls, and frantic screaming coming from the apartment. At one point, Zazel, fearing for her life, tried to escape, running out into the hallway to get away. But William chased her down, grabbed her, and dragged her back inside. The neighbors heard the commotion, but unfortunately, because the couple fought so often, no one called the police, assuming it was just another one of their loud domestic disputes. Eventually, the horrific noises stopped and the apartment fell completely silent in the early hours of Christmas morning. A few hours later, the sun rose, and the 2 young girls woke up with excitement. They ran down the hallway and burst into the living room, eager to see what Santa had left under the tree. The living room was beautifully decorated with colorful lights, festive wreaths, and stockings stuffed with treats. Sitting on the couch together were William, holding the baby boy, and Zazel. The girls happily tore into their presents, ripping off the bright paper to reveal their brand new toys. Every time they unwrapped something exciting, they would turn around to show their parents. William would smile and tell them how great the toys were. But when the girls turned to their mother to show her their gifts, she did not move. She just sat perfectly still on the couch, wearing a pair of dark sunglasses, completely ignoring them. The girls tried to get her attention, calling out to her and showing her the toys up close, but she remained completely unresponsive. Finally, the 8-year-old girl turned to William and asked what was wrong with her mother. William paused, glared at Zazel, and then looked back at his daughter. He told the young girls that their mother had gotten drunk the night before and had ruined Christmas. The girls, used to their parents' frequent arguments, assumed they were just fighting again, so they turned back to their toys and tried to ignore the tense silence. Around 9 o'clock that morning, William stood up, walked into another room, and dialed 911. He told the dispatcher that his wife had suffered an accident. He claimed she had gotten heavily intoxicated, lost her balance, and fallen through a glass coffee table, injuring herself badly. When paramedics and police officers arrived at the apartment, they immediately realized that something was terribly wrong. Zazel was lying on the couch, and she was cold to the touch. She was dead. The police began examining the apartment and found blood splattered in multiple rooms, along with physical evidence of a brutal struggle. It was clear that she had not fallen through a table. The medical examiner later determined that Zazel had been beaten to death. William had physically assaulted her for hours, inflicting severe blunt force trauma to her head and body. After realizing he had killed her, instead of calling for help, William decided to stage the scene. He dragged her lifeless body to the living room couch, propped her up to make it look like she was sitting, and placed sunglasses over her eyes to hide her injuries from their young children. He then forced the children to open their Christmas presents in front of their mother's corpse while he sat beside her. William was arrested and charged with her murder. During the trial, the prosecution presented the heartbreaking details of how the young girls had spent their Christmas morning playing and laughing in front of their deceased mother, completely unaware of the horror that had occurred. William was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The children were placed in the custody of Zazel's parents, left to grow up with the haunting memory of that Christmas morning. Now let us move to our final story, which takes us to the country of Honduras in August of 2015. In a small, impoverished town called La Entrada, a 16-year-old girl named Nasi Perez woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. As she lay in her dark room, she looked around at her surroundings. She lived in a small, crowded home where several of her relatives slept close together, some of them resting on the floor. The air was thick and humid, typical of the tropical climate. Nacy realized that the reason she had woken up was because she urgently needed to use the restroom. She carefully stood up, trying her best not to step on any of her sleeping family members as she made her way toward the back door of the house. Nacy's life was not easy. La Entrada was located in a region known for extreme poverty and high rates of violence. But despite these harsh conditions, Nacy was incredibly happy. She had recently married her high school sweetheart, a young man named Rudy, and the two of them were deeply in love. They had met at a local market, and despite their limited means, they were excited to build a future together. Rudy worked a low-paying construction job, and Nacy planned to stay at home to raise their family. Even more exciting was the fact that Nacy was pregnant. She was a few months away from giving birth to their very first child, and both she and Rudy were eager to start their new family together. They had even started building a tiny room on his parents' land to have a space of their own. Nacy pushed open the wooden back door and stepped out into the darkness of the backyard. Like many homes in this rural area, her family did not have indoor plumbing, so she had to walk across the dirt yard to reach an outdoor outhouse. She began making the familiar walk, but she would never actually reach her destination. The next morning, Nacy's mother, Maria, was the first to wake up. As she started her morning routine, she walked toward the back door and looked out into the yard. To her horror, she saw her teenage daughter lying motionless on the ground. Maria screamed and ran outside, flipping Nacy over onto her back. Nacy's eyes were rolled back, she was completely unresponsive, and she was foaming at the mouth. In rural Honduras, access to modern medical care is extremely limited and the culture is deeply religious and traditional. Instead of thinking to call an ambulance or rush her to a hospital, Maria and the rest of the family, who had run outside after hearing the screams, believed that something supernatural was happening. Because Nacy was foaming at the mouth and completely stiff, they assumed she had been possessed by an evil spirit or a demon. They quickly contacted a local priest and begged him to come to the house to perform an exorcism. The priest arrived and spent hours performing religious rituals, praying over Nacy's body, and splashing holy water in an attempt to cast out the supposed demons. But despite his efforts, Nacy remained completely unresponsive. Finally, realizing that the rituals were not working and that her condition was worsening, the panicked family carried her to the nearest hospital. By the time they arrived, doctors examined her and could find no signs of life. They officially declared Nacy dead. When the devastated family asked what had caused a healthy 16-year-old pregnant girl to suddenly pass away, the doctors could not give them a clear answer. They simply stated that her heart had stopped. Heartbroken, Maria, Rudy, and the rest of the family took Nacy's body back home. They held a traditional wake, and the very next day they prepared for her burial. In this part of Honduras, burials are often done above ground due to the soil conditions and local customs. Nacy's body was placed inside a wooden coffin. This coffin was then transported to the local cemetery, where a large, freestanding concrete tomb had been prepared. The tomb was a hollow concrete block just large enough to fit the coffin. Workers slid the coffin inside the concrete structure and then sealed the opening with wet cement and bricks, completely closing her off from the outside world. The family said their final goodbyes and left her there to rest, their hearts heavy with grief. The loss was absolutely devastating for Rudy. Not only had he lost his young wife, but he had also lost his unborn child. He was consumed by grief and could not sleep. The morning after the burial, Rudy decided he needed to go to the cemetery to be close to her. He walked through the gates of the quiet graveyard, navigating through the rows of concrete tombs until he found the one containing Nacy's body. He walked up to the structure, leaned his body against the cold, rough cement, and began to sob quietly, whispering how much he missed her. But as he stood there with his head pressed against the concrete, he heard something that made his heart stop. From deep inside the sealed tomb, there was a faint, muffled sound. It sounded like someone scratching against wood. Then, he heard a weak, distant voice screaming for help. Rudy stood frozen for a second, wondering if his grief was causing him to lose his mind. But then he heard it again. It was the unmistakable sound of his wife's voice crying out from inside the concrete block. Rudy panicked. He turned and ran as fast as he could to find the cemetery caretaker and his family. He screamed that his wife was alive, that she was trapped inside the tomb. Within minutes, Rudy's family and local workers arrived at the gravesite with sledgehammers and crowbars. They began frantically smashing through the newly sealed concrete wall, desperate to get to the coffin. A small crowd gathered, watching in disbelief as the workers broke through the bricks and pulled the wooden coffin out of the tomb. They quickly pried open the lid, and what they saw inside was absolutely horrifying. Nacy's body was warm and she was sweating. The glass viewing window on the top of the coffin, which sat directly over her face, had been completely shattered. Her hands were bruised and bloodied, and there were deep scratch marks on the inside of the wooden lid. It was clear that she had tried desperately to claw her way out. Shards of broken glass were scattered around her face, and some had even gotten into her eyes and mouth as she screamed for help in the pitch blackness. She was unconscious, but when her family touched her neck, they felt a faint, weak pulse. They quickly lifted her out of the coffin and rushed her back to the hospital, praying for a miracle. But tragically, the miracle would not come. By the time they arrived at the medical facility, the doctors checked her pulse again, but this time she was truly gone. They tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. The doctors explained that Nacy had likely passed away from a lack of oxygen just moments before they managed to pull her out of the coffin. The investigation into this unbelievable tragedy revealed a horrific series of events. It turned out that Nacy had never actually been dead when she was first brought to the hospital. Medical experts believe that when she collapsed in her yard, she had experienced a medical event rather than death. There are two primary theories about what happened to her that night. The first theory is that she heard a nearby gunshot, which triggered a massive, overwhelming panic attack that caused her heart rate to spike and led to a temporary state of suspended animation. The second, and more likely, theory is that she suffered from a severe episode of cataplexy. Cataplexy is a rare neurological condition often linked to narcolepsy, where strong emotional triggers such as fear, anger, or sudden shock cause a total and sudden loss of voluntary muscle control. During a severe episode of cataplexy, a person can appear completely paralyzed, with their breathing and heart rate dropping to levels so low that they are nearly imperceptible without advanced medical equipment. In a rural hospital with limited diagnostic tools, the doctors simply assumed she had passed away. Nacy had been conscious, or at least alive, the entire time. She had been awake during her own funeral, trapped in a state of paralysis, unable to move or speak as her family wept over her. It was only after she was sealed inside the dark, airtight concrete tomb that the paralysis finally wore off. When she woke up, she found herself trapped in absolute darkness, confined within a tight wooden box. She had spent hours screaming, crying, and clawing at the wood, eventually smashing the glass window over her face in a desperate attempt to breathe, but there was only solid concrete on the other side. She had fought for her life for over 24 hours in that suffocating darkness, and she had only run out of oxygen right as her husband arrived to hear her final cries. The tragedy left the town and her family completely devastated, haunted by the knowledge that a simple medical misdiagnosis had led to a young, pregnant girl being buried alive. Rudy was left completely heartbroken, forced to live with the memory of hearing his wife's voice calling out from inside her tomb, a haunting sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short, a newlywed woman only wanted to change her last name, but one routine DMV email uncovered a 22-year nightmare. Karen Davis thought Oklahoma had flagged an old unpaid ticket or paperwork issue. But when she called the number, the district attorney's office told her she had been listed as a wanted felon for decades. The bizarre crime? In 1999, her roommate used her card to rent a VHS copy of Sabrina the Teenage Witch and never returned it. For years, Karen couldn't understand why jobs kept rejecting her. Then she realized one forgotten movie had quietly ruined her life. Watch the full story on the channel. Day 1 in 1980, a 28-year-old American man disappeared deep in the Amazon jungle while searching for a lost city that many people believe didn't even exist. Nearly 10 years later, his sister received a letter from a German detective warning her that multiple people searching for this same city had also vanished, and that someone in the jungle might be killing them, but that was only the first story. Because tonight's episode is about people who believed in something so completely that it slowly led them toward obsession, isolation, and ultimately tragedy. One afternoon in November of 1980, a 28-year-old man named John Reed was sitting at a small table on the veranda of a remote hotel in the tiny Brazilian village of Barcelos. Reaching this place had not been easy. It required a 2-day boat ride up a winding river from Manaus, the largest city in the Amazon. Sitting across from John was a man he had traveled thousands of miles to meet, the legendary tribal chief known as Tatunka Nera. According to a controversial book written by a German journalist, Tatunka was supposedly the only living person who had ever visited the lost underground city of Acacor and returned alive. Most people believed the story was complete fiction. John Reed did not. For years, he had dreamed of coming to the Amazon, and now, after traveling thousands of miles into the jungle, he was finally sitting face to face with the man who claimed to know where Acacor was hidden. Barcelos and Tatunka were a world away from where John had grown up. Barcelos and Tatunka were a world away from where John had grown up. He was from San Francisco, California, a place of suburbs and concrete, a far cry from the dense, humid jungle that now surrounded him. But even as a kid growing up there, he had harbored this deep, persistent dream of coming to the Amazon. And not just to see it, but specifically to meet this man, Tatunka. So for John, sitting here felt completely surreal. He had actually done it. He had made his dream a reality. And if things continued to go the way he hoped, he might never have to go back to America at all. Because John wasn't just on a vacation, he was on a quest. He was in Barcelos with one singular goal, to be the person who finally discovered the long-lost city of Acacor. The very existence of this city was the subject of intense debate. There was almost no historical or archaeological record to prove it was real. In fact, Pretty much all the information about it came from a single book called The Chronicle of Akakor, written by a German journalist named Karl Brugger. According to Karl's book, Akakor wasn't just some ancient ruin. It was the capital city of a civilization that was over 12,000 years old. He compared them to the Incas or the ancient Egyptians, a vast empire with technology and knowledge that was extremely advanced for its time. But Karl claimed that the people of Akakor were superior, that they were literal descendants of gods who had come from the sky. And when European colonizers arrived in the Amazon centuries ago, the people of Akakor hadn't been wiped out like so many other indigenous groups. Instead, they had retreated, moving their entire civilization into a massive network of underground tunnels and cities. It was there, hidden beneath the jungle floor, that they had rebuilt their capital and concealed themselves from the modern world. The legend even said they were still living there right now, guarding a priceless treasure that had been gifted to them by their divine ancestors. Now, most academics and historians dismissed Karl's book as pure fiction. They said the author had just invented this elaborate story to sell books and make a name for himself. But John Reed paid no attention to the skeptics. Any small doubts he might have harbored had completely vanished the moment he laid eyes on Tatanka Nara. You see, Tatanka wasn't just some famous local chief who knew the jungle inside and out. More importantly, at least to John, he was a key figure interviewed in Karl's book. The book described him as the only known living person who had actually been to the hidden city of Akakor. And now, here he was, in the flesh, sitting right across from John, looking every bit the part of an Amazonian chief. He wore a simple loincloth, and on his chest was the distinctive turtle tattoo that the book had described in detail. For John, this was definitive proof. If Tatanka was real, then everything else in that book had to be real too. But right now, the conversation had stalled. Both John and Tatanka were silent, which was unusual. Normally, their meetings were filled with energy, with Tatanka telling John incredible stories about Akakor, describing its wonders in his heavily accented, broken English. But just hearing the stories wasn't enough for John anymore. He wanted to see it for himself. He wanted to know where Akakor was. So far, Tatanka had been evasive. He'd explained that the people of Akakor wished to remain hidden, that their very survival depended on their secrecy, and that he, as their trusted friend, could not betray their location. But today felt different. A few minutes ago, John had asked him again, more directly this time, about being taken to Akakor. And ever since then, Tatanka had been sitting in this deep, contemplative silence as if he was finally weighing whether or not to reveal the secret. John waited patiently, not wanting to break the spell. As he sat there, the silence was so intense, he felt he could almost feel Tatanka's ancient wisdom radiating off of him. And then, finally, in his soft, fragmented English, Tatanka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on a spring evening in 1989, John's sister, a 35-year-old woman named Sandy Reed, pulled her car into the driveway of her home near San Francisco. She got out to check the mail, feeling tired and worn out from her day job in sales. She reached into the mailbox and pulled out a stack of envelopes, sorting through them mindlessly as she walked toward her front door. But then, the return address on one of the letters caught her eye and made her stop in her tracks. The letter was postmarked from Germany. Sandy didn't know anyone in Germany. She had no friends or family there, so she couldn't imagine what it could be. With a growing sense of unease, she ripped open the envelope. As her eyes moved across the lines of text on the page, her hands began to shake. The letter was from a German detective. He was writing to her about her brother, John. The detective wrote that they had reason to believe something terrible had happened to him. John, her adventurous brother, had left for Brazil almost a decade ago on his quest to find the lost city of Akakor. For all those years, Sandy and her parents had not heard a single word from him since he left. During the first couple of weeks of his trip, he had been a fairly regular correspondent, sending letters home describing his excitement and the strange new world he was in. But then, in late 1980, the letters had just stopped, and after that, there was only silence. Of course, Sandy had worried about him. The Amazon jungle was a dangerous place, and John was out there on his own, but at the same time, she hadn't been completely surprised that he'd gone silent. She and her parents knew better than anyone how obsessed John was with Akakor. He hadn't just wanted to go on an adventure and find some lost city. His plan was to find it and never come home. He wanted to leave his old life behind and stay in the jungle forever. So the family had created a narrative to cope with his absence. They told themselves that he had probably succeeded. Maybe he had found a Akakor, or perhaps he'd just found another village, another tribe that had welcomed him in. Either way, they believed that John was simply living the new life he had always wanted somewhere deep in the jungle, and that was why he hadn't been in touch. For nearly 10 years, that was the story they told themselves. But now, as Sandy stood there reading this letter from a German detective, that entire story, her whole understanding of what had happened to her brother, was shattered in an instant. She was suddenly filled with a confusing mix of panic and utter confusion. First, there was the terrifying idea that John was in serious trouble, or worse. But second, why were the German police looking for him? Why wasn't it the American authorities? As she read on, her eyes scanning the page frantically, she found the answer. The detective explained that they were investigating the death or disappearance of not just John, but at least 3 other people, one of whom was a German citizen. And all of these individuals had apparently been lured into the Amazon by the very same book, the one about a lost city called Akakor. This book, the detective stated plainly, was a complete fabrication. Akakor was not a real place, it was a myth. But the detective believed that someone in Brazil was using this myth as a trap, killing the people who came looking for the non-existent city. He went on to say that his investigation had hit a wall. The Brazilian authorities were being extremely uncooperative, and he was not being allowed to travel to Brazil to gather evidence or interview witnesses. He was effectively stuck, unable to move the case forward. He was writing to her simply to let her know that they were looking into her brother's disappearance and that they suspected foul play. By the time Sandy finished the letter, she felt a powerful, overwhelming urge to act. If the German police couldn't go to Brazil, then maybe she could. Later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the bustling city of Manaus, deep in the Amazon, and checked into a small hotel. She knew from John's last letters, sent all those years ago, that this was the general area where he had been before he disappeared. Her plan was loose, but her determination was firm. She was going to turn this city upside down and find out what happened to her brother. It was a monumental task, of course. Manaus is a huge, sprawling city. But Sandy was fully committed to this mission. For 10 years, she had lived with the uncertainty, but now something had shifted inside her. It was as if she was being called a deep, internal pull to go and find him, no matter the cost. She had quit her sales job, emptied her entire savings account, and bought a one-way ticket. She even brought a small audio tape recorder with her, determined to document every conversation, every clue, so she wouldn't miss a single detail. Her strategy was simple. She would spend all her time talking to the locals, interviewing anyone and everyone, recording what they said, hoping that someone, somewhere, knew something about John or Akakor. But almost as soon as she began her search on the ground in Manaus, she realized just how difficult, and perhaps impossible, her task was going to be. It had been nearly a decade since John had gone missing. When she met with the local Brazilian law enforcement, they were polite but unhelpful. They had almost no information about his disappearance and couldn't offer her any useful leads. When she spoke to the local residents, she was met with a flood of endless rumors, none of which came with any real evidence. And to make matters worse, all the rumors contradicted each other. One person told her that a white man matching John's description had been seen just recently on the outskirts of the city. But then another person would claim that John had been shot and killed years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. Then a third person would dismiss both stories, insisting that John had simply found an indigenous tribe, not the people of Akakor, but another one, and had chosen to live with them, cutting himself off from the outside world. Despite the conflicting information, there was one common thread, one reaction that almost everyone had when she brought up her brother's quest: fear. Every time Sandy mentioned the name Akakor, people would immediately clam up. Their expressions would change, their voices would lower. They were clearly scared of something connected to that name. They all knew about the legend, but most of the time, they warned her to leave it alone. They told her not to talk about it, that looking for Akakor could get her into serious trouble, that it could even get her killed. As the days turned into weeks, Sandy felt herself sinking into a state of confusion and anxiety. Each night, she would lie in her humid hotel bed, listening to the sounds of the city, and wonder if she should just give up. This felt impossible. But then, almost every night after she fell asleep, she would have a vivid dream about John. It was like he was visiting her, trying to tell her something. In these dreams, he would always say the same thing. Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So, nearly every morning, she would wake up with a renewed, albeit shaky, sense of purpose. The dreams pushed her to keep looking, but her search just kept leading to more dead ends. Then, during her last few days in Manaus, when her money was almost gone and she knew she'd have to go home soon, she heard another rumor. This one was different. It was more specific. It claimed that John hadn't gone into the jungle blindly. He had been given directions. A local chief named Tatanka had apparently told him how to get to Akakor. By this point, Sandy had spent 3 grueling weeks in and around Manaus, and she felt completely overwhelmed. The constant sense of fear surrounding Akakor had started to seep into her own bones. She was beginning to feel that by digging into this, she was putting herself in danger. And in many ways, hearing this new name, Tatanka, didn't give her hope, it made her even more scared. Part of her wanted desperately to find this man and ask him what he knew, but another, larger part of her was terrified to even pursue this lead. The weight of it all, the strangeness and the danger just felt too heavy. And so, after learning about Tatanka, Sandy's first reaction was to pack her bags and leave Brazil. But her search for her brother wasn't over. After leaving Brazil, she didn't just fly back to California and give up. She decided to continue her investigation, but in a more roundabout, safer way. A local in Manaus had mentioned that a Swiss tourist might have seen John in the jungle years ago. So, Sandy flew to Switzerland and tracked down this tourist. Then, after that lead went nowhere, she flew to Germany to meet in person with the detective who had sent her that life-altering letter. but neither the tourist nor the detective had any new information for her. So, after all that traveling, she was still left with no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her life savings, chasing ghosts across continents, and it had led to nothing. She was broke, scared, and no closer to the truth. She seriously considered just going home for good. But there was still that one lead she hadn't followed up on, the one that had scared her away, Tatanka. It felt like a loose thread that she had to pull. She had a gut feeling that if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never find out what really happened. It felt like he was the key to the entire mystery, and she had been too cowardly to turn it. She knew she had to go back. She needed closure. So she returned to the United States, but only for a short time. She took a job cleaning houses, working day and night to earn just enough money to finance one last trip back to the Amazon on June 21st, 1990. Almost exactly a year after her first trip, Sandy returned to Brazil. This time, she took a small propeller plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was Tatanka's home base. And this time, she wasn't alone. She brought backup, a documentary producer and a reporter. She felt much safer traveling with a team, but she also hoped that by bringing media attention to the case, she might finally get some real resources and help in finding her brother. When their small plane landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her team stepped out into the oppressive heat and walked into the tiny village. In the time she'd been back in America, Sandy had done her research. She knew that Carl Brugger's book, the one that had sent her brother on his fatal quest, had actually created a small but steady tourism economy in Barcelos. People from all over the world came here to talk to Tatanka and try to find Akakor. But as far as Sandy could tell, looking around the village, that tourist boom hadn't done much for the local people. The village was dusty, and the houses were mostly rundown shacks. She had read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, there was only a single telephone. As her group wandered through the village, looking for someone to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman hanging laundry on a line outside her home. Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where she could find Tatanka. The woman nodded immediately, which was what Sandy expected. She now knew a lot more about Tatanka. She knew he was a renowned local figure, a chief who had once guided an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. He was also considered a local hero. There was a story that he had once saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane crashed in the jungle. Because of this, the country's secret service was supposedly indebted to him. And of course, he was the star of the Chronicle of Akakor, the only man who knew the city's location. More recently, however, Tatanka had settled into a quieter life, running a small hotel and giving boat tours to tourists along the Rio Negro. The woman gave Sandy directions to Tatanka's hotel. As Sandy and her team made their way deeper into the village, she felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. There was something about finally meeting this man that felt incredibly heavy, like she was approaching the final chapter of a book she wasn't sure she wanted to finish. Eventually, they arrived at what looked like an isolated hotel surrounded by a high wooden gate. And there, sitting on the veranda, was a lean, shirtless man with a prominent turtle tattoo on his chest. Sandy knew instantly from the tattoo that it had to be him. That was Tatanka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked toward him, she pulled out a photograph of her brother. She held it up and began to explain, in a trembling voice, why she was there. Tatanka just listened at first, watching them approach with a calm expression. But as he started to understand what she was saying, a small smile formed on his face. And in his broken English, he told Sandy that he was surprised she hadn't come to see him sooner. But Sandy didn't smile back, because as she stared at the man in front of her, all she could think was how wrong it all was. Tatanka's face, the way he spoke, his accent, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It turned out those dreams Sandy had been having, the ones where her brother John appeared to her and warned her that Akakor was not what he thought it would be, were absolutely correct. Akakor didn't exist, but it wasn't just a fictional city created by an author to sell books. The truth was much stranger and much more sinister than that. Carl Brugger's entire book was based almost exclusively on the stories told to him by Tatanka Nara, the legendary Amazonian chief who was now standing right in front of Sandy. But the man in front of her was not a chief of any tribe. In fact, he wasn't even from the Amazon. He wasn't indigenous at all. In reality, the man who had been parading around as Tatanka Nara for decades was just a German man named Günther Hauck. He had fled Germany in the 1960s to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife. When he arrived in the Amazon, he needed a way to blend in and support himself, but he didn't speak the language and he had a very thick German accent. So he invented an entire identity. He created a fantastic made-up story about a long-lost civilization he claimed to be descended from. The entire legend of Akakor was a lie he created just so he could hide from his responsibilities back home. But the problem was, his lie worked too well. Günther managed to convince not just the local villagers but also national authorities that he was a real indigenous chief. And then, fatefully, he convinced the writer Carl Brugger, who turned his tall tales into an international bestseller. This inadvertently created an entire tourism industry with Günther at its center. So when the book came out and tourists started arriving in Barcelos, Günther found himself trapped in his own lie. To keep his new source of income flowing, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and that he knew where it was, while at the same time making sure that no one ever actually got there to expose his fraud. Both Sandy and the German police came to believe that in order to protect this secret, Günther Hauck killed any tourists who got too close to the truth or insisted too strongly on being taken to the mythical city, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Günther Hauck has never been charged with murder and has always denied hurting anyone. John Reed's body has never been found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, and rumors still swirl about who was responsible for his murder and why. As of 2024, Günther Hauck was confirmed to be alive, still living in Barcelona, still insisting that the city of Akakor is real. And to this day, adventurers and explorers still travel to Barcelos, hoping to be the one to finally find it. On the night of November 14th, 1994, a 56-year-old man named Dwight Finley was driving his pickup truck up a snowy, single-lane highway deep in the mountains of Oregon. It was late at night, but Dwight was wide awake, his focus absolute. It was taking every single ounce of his concentration just to keep the truck on the road. A heavy snow was falling, blanketing everything in white, and the road beneath his tires was a treacherous sheet of ice. To make matters even more difficult, Dwight was towing a large camper van behind his truck. The heavy van kept sliding and fishtailing on the slick surface, causing the whole rig to feel unstable and on the verge of losing control. As he drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the only thought in his head was what a terrible mistake he had made by taking this route. Dwight was a traveling salesman. His business was selling high-end camper vans, which is why he had this demo model hitched to his truck. He would drive it from city to city to show off to potential clients. He had just finished a sales trip in the coastal town of Coos Bay, Oregon, and was now on his way to his next appointment in Grants Pass, in the southern part of the state. The drive should have been a straightforward 2.5 hours. But Dwight had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through a remote and mountainous national forest. He had imagined a peaceful, tranquil drive surrounded by the lush, stunning scenery of the Oregon wilderness. Instead, he was now trapped in a full-blown blizzard, fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested mountain pass with a sheer cliff dropping off on one side of the narrow road. This would have been a harrowing experience for any driver, but for Dwight, he was especially out of his element. He was originally from sunny Los Angeles, California. He had never driven in conditions like this in his life. He had only recently moved to Montana that past summer with his fiancée and 2 children. And while Montana was known for its harsh winters, he hadn't actually experienced one yet. So this was his first real taste of a severe winter storm, and he was learning to drive in it on the edge of a cliff. But Dwight was a deeply religious man. And so, as the stressful drive sent his heart rate soaring, he began to pray. He just prayed quietly to himself, asking for safety and guidance to get through this. For a while, it seemed to be working. He managed to keep the truck on the road, slowly but surely making his way up the pass. He started to think he was going to make it through after all. But then, inevitably, his truck began to slide on a patch of ice. In a moment of panic, Dwight slammed on the brakes as hard as he could, which was the worst possible thing to do. It caused the vehicle to slide even more violently. The next few seconds were a chaotic blur of snow, darkness, and spinning trees. He was certain he was about to go over the cliff, but then, after what felt like an eternity, his truck slammed to a halt, crashing into a large snowbank on the side of the road. And just like that, everything went quiet and still. For a moment, Dwight just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and his entire body was trembling with adrenaline. After a few minutes passed and he was able to catch his breath, he started to assess the situation. The first and most important thing was that he hadn't gone off the cliff. That was a huge relief. He had survived. He checked himself over for injuries, and amazingly, he seemed to be completely unharmed. From where he was sitting, it looked like his truck was probably okay, too. The exterior might be a little dinged up from hitting the snowbank, but it seemed he had just slid off the road into deep snow. To Dwight, it felt like nothing short of a miracle. He immediately felt that his prayers had been answered, God had been looking out for him and had saved his life. But his relief was short-lived. When Dwight shifted his truck into reverse and tried to back out of the snowbank, the tires just spun uselessly. They couldn't get any traction in the deep, soft snow. He realized that while he had survived the crash, he was now stranded, deep in the wilderness of the Oregon mountains, in the middle of a blizzard. It was the middle of the night. He didn't have a cell phone or a radio, so he had no way to call for help. He hadn't been expecting to get stuck, so he had packed no extra food or water. He had no emergency provisions at all. And he hadn't seen another car on this road for a very long time, so he had no idea if anyone else ever used this route, especially in the winter. And to top it all off, no one knew he was here. He wasn't supposed to be on this road, so if anyone came looking for him, this would be the last place they'd check. Just as panic began to well up inside him again, Dwight took a deep breath and said another prayer. He reasoned that God had already saved him once tonight, and he just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt managed to calm himself down enough to eventually fall asleep. When he woke up the next morning, it was immediately clear that his situation had gotten worse. It was still snowing outside, and it had obviously been snowing all night long. His truck was now buried much more deeply in the snow. The snowdrifts came all the way up to the bottom of his windows. There had to be multiple feet of new snow on the ground. DeWitt started the truck again and put it in reverse, hoping that maybe he could get out now. It was a long shot, and as soon as he hit the gas, the tires just spun again. He hadn't moved an inch. Now that it was daylight, he thought he might be able to look around and spot a house, a cabin, or any sign of civilization in the distance that could give him a sense of where he was. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction was a uniform sea of white. Just trees and snow. He couldn't even see the road anymore. He had gotten so turned around during the crash that he had no idea which way it was. He was just lost in a whiteout. DeWitt tried his best not to panic. Instead, he focused on taking stock of what he did have. He began looking around the cab of his truck for any useful supplies. He found he actually had a few things that could help. There were some cushions and a sheet in the cab, so he could make a makeshift bed for himself. He could use the truck's heater to stay warm and to melt snow for drinking water, though he knew he'd have to be very careful not to use up all his fuel. Of course, he also had the entire camper attached to the back of his truck. In a situation like this, you would think that would be a huge advantage. You could just live in the camper until you were rescued. But DeWitt knew this wasn't a real camper. It was a demo model. It was completely empty inside. It was just a shell with no furniture, no heat, no supplies, nothing. It wasn't going to be much help. But after DeWitt finished this mental inventory of his meager supplies, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He felt that he had enough to keep himself alive for a little while, and he was confident that in that time he would be found. He decided he would just have to leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally passed. But even with the clear skies, the snow didn't melt. And then, a few days after that, another storm rolled in and dumped even more snow and ice on his truck, burying him even deeper. During all this time, DeWitt didn't see or hear a single other car, truck, or snowplow. He came to the conclusion that the remote road he had crashed on was now so completely clogged with snow that it was impassable. But even though DeWitt was getting extremely hungry by this point, he had no food at all. He was still warm and dry inside his truck. And critically, he was staying hydrated. He had been drinking plenty of melted snow. He was surviving. To keep the negative thoughts at bay, the fear of what could happen to him out here alone, DeWitt had started a ritual. He began meticulously crossing off each day in his yearly planning calendar. He also started writing letters. DeWitt always carried pens, paper, and envelopes in his work bag, which he had with him in the truck. So he began writing to the people he loved most, his fiancée, his sons, and even a letter to his boss, explaining what had happened and why he had missed his appointments. In these letters, DeWitt didn't sound scared or sad. In fact, he sounded almost rejuvenated, even happy. He wrote about how much love and joy there was in his life and how lucky he felt to have his family. He told his fiancée and his sons not to worry about him. He knew with absolute certainty that he was going to be okay because God was looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, but DeWitt managed to stay warm and relatively comfortable, and somehow he stayed alive, even without a single bite of food. To DeWitt, his continued survival, his ability to endure the hunger, was another sign that God was watching over him. DeWitt had no idea how long a person could live without eating, but after 2 full months had passed, which he knew because he had crossed off every single day in his calendar, he felt like he should be dead. He hadn't eaten anything in 2 months. The fact that he was still alive felt like a clear sign. It had to be God keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. He just had to keep the faith. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager and his girlfriend were driving up that very same mountain road where DeWitt had crashed months earlier. Even though it was May, there was still a lot of snow on the ground, and the road was still icy in places. About halfway up a particularly steep section, the teenager lost control of his truck. It started to skid, and he went off the road, crashing into a snowbank. Luckily, both he and his girlfriend were okay. They sat there for a minute, a bit dazed. Then the driver put the truck in reverse and tried to back out, but just like with DeWitt's truck, his wouldn't move either. The tires just spun in the snow. So the teenager got out of his truck to see if there was any serious damage or if he was just stuck. But as he stood there looking at his own vehicle, he noticed something else just a little further up the road. It was another vehicle, a pickup truck with a camper attached, half buried in the melting snow. The teenager told his girlfriend he was going to go take a look, just in case someone else had crashed and needed help. He left his girlfriend in his truck and started hiking through the snow over to the other vehicle. When he got there, he couldn't see inside. The windows were still mostly covered with snow and ice. He used his hands to brush away some of the snow from the driver's side window. He peered inside, and for a second he couldn't quite make out what he was seeing, but then his eyes adjusted and he saw it, and when he did, he gasped and stumbled backward in shock. After DeWitt crashed his truck, he was absolutely certain that he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated place, but he truly believed that God was going to save him. He felt that God had intervened to keep him from going over the cliff, and now God would intervene again to send help. Because of this powerful, unwavering belief, DeWitt never really left his truck. He might have stepped out briefly to relieve himself, but for the most part, he stayed inside, waiting. Tragically, if he had just gotten out and walked around a little, if he had explored his immediate surroundings, he would have discovered something incredible. Not far from where he had crashed, there was a paved maintenance path, and due to the unique way the wind whipped around that particular side of the mountain, the snow never accumulated on it. It remained clear. Even after the huge blizzards, he would have seen a clear, black paved path leading down the mountainside, a path that would have taken him right down to civilization and saved his life. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited, help would come to him that he never looked for another way out. And when he began to feel the incredible, agonizing pain of starvation, the very fact that he wasn't dying, that he was surviving for months with no food, it only strengthened his resolve. It became proof to him that God had a plan, that he should be dead but wasn't. All he had to do was maintain his faith, and he would be saved. In some ways, it was a beautiful and poetic testament to his faith. But ultimately, that same faith led directly to his death. The teenage driver who crashed in almost the exact same spot was looking at DeWitt's truck and camper. And when he had cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, deceased, still sitting in the driver's seat. DeWitt Finley had ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which was the final day he had crossed off on his calendar. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Tab 1 in January of 1993, a young mother named Bonnie Heim was living a life filled with quiet dread. She was 23, living in a modest, single-story home on Delfiore Drive in Jacksonville, Florida. To anyone looking from the outside, Bonnie seemed to have a normal, stable life. She was married to a man named Michael Haim, and together they had a beautiful 3-year-old son named Aaron. Bonnie worked as an office manager at a construction company owned by Michael's father, which meant she handled the bookkeeping and knew how to manage finances. But behind closed doors, Bonnie's life was anything but stable. Her marriage to Michael was unraveling, and it was becoming increasingly dangerous. Michael was a controlling and aggressive man, and their arguments were loud, frequent, and terrifying for both Bonnie and little Aaron. Bonnie knew she had to get out, not just for her own sake, but to protect her young son from the toxic environment. But leaving a controlling partner is never simple, and Bonnie had to plan her escape with absolute secrecy because she worked as an office manager. Bonnie was smart with money. She knew that to build a new life for herself and Aaron, she would need a financial safety net. So, without Michael's knowledge, she opened a secret bank account. Over several months, she carefully deposited small amounts of money into this account, saving $34,000. This was enough to secure an apartment and keep her and Aaron afloat for a long time. But the problem was, Michael eventually found out about the secret account. He was furious. He confronted Bonnie and demanded that she close the account immediately. Under his pressure and fear of what he might do, Bonnie had no choice but to comply. She closed the account and withdrew all the money. But Bonnie was incredibly resilient. She did not let this setback crush her dream of escape. Instead, she adapted. She began taking cash in small increments and giving it to a trusted friend named Evan Carter. Evan kept the money safe for her, away from Michael's prying eyes. Bonnie also went to a local bank and opened a safe deposit box, giving a spare key to Evan just in case anything happened to her. By early January of 1993, Bonnie decided it was time to make her move. She had found a new apartment, paid the deposit using her hidden cash, and scheduled her move-out date for January 7, 1993. Her plan was to wait until Michael went to work that morning, pack up her and Aaron's belongings, and disappear before he ever got back. It was a solid plan, and Bonnie felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. But then, January 6 arrived. On the evening of January 6, Bonnie was at home on Delfiore Drive with Aaron while Michael was out. She called her friend Evan Carter to finalize the details for the next day. Bonnie was nervous, but excited, telling Evan that she had finally done it and that she was ready to start over. But during their conversation, the front door opened and Michael walked into the house. Bonnie's tone immediately changed. She became quiet and tense, trying to end the phone call quickly. Before she could hang up, Evan heard Michael's voice in the background. He sounded angry. Bonnie told Evan she had to go, and the line went dead. That was the last time anyone ever heard Bonnie Haim's voice. The next morning, January 7, 1993, Bonnie did not show up for work. This was highly unusual for her, as she was incredibly reliable. Her boss, who was also Michael's father, called the house to see where she was. Michael answered the phone and calmly explained that Bonnie was sick and was sleeping in. But as the hours ticked by, Bonnie still did not appear. Later that day, Michael's story shifted. He claimed that he and Bonnie had gotten into a massive argument the night before, and in the middle of the night, Bonnie had packed a suitcase, walked out of the house, and driven away in her car, leaving him and 3-year-old Aaron behind. But nobody who knew Bonnie believed this story for a single second. Bonnie was a deeply devoted mother. She loved Aaron more than anything in the world, and there was absolutely no way she would ever abandon her 3-year-old son, especially not with a man she was actively trying to escape. Her family and friends immediately suspected that something terrible had happened to her, and they pleaded with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to investigate. The police started looking into Bonnie's disappearance, and almost immediately, things did not add up. Later that same day, a maintenance worker at a hotel near the Jacksonville International Airport was emptying a dumpster in the parking lot. As he tossed a bag in, he noticed a woman's purse sitting right on top of the trash. He pulled it out and opened it, finding Bonnie Haim's identification, credit cards, and personal items inside. He immediately called the police. When investigators arrived at the airport, they began searching the parking lots and quickly located Bonnie's gray Toyota. At first glance, it looked like Bonnie had driven to the airport and fled. But when detectives got closer to the car, they noticed a series of glaring anomalies. First, the driver's seat was pushed all the way back, as far as it could go. Bonnie was a short woman, only about 5 feet and 3 inches tall. There was no physical way she could have driven the car with the seat in that position. Her feet wouldn't have even reached the pedals. But Michael Haim was a tall man, and the seat position fit his frame perfectly. Second, when detectives looked at the tires, they noticed they were covered in thick, dark mud. This was highly suspicious because the airport parking lot was paved and the roads leading to it were clean. The mud on the tires suggested the car had recently been driven through a rural, unpaved area. Finally, the car key was missing from the ignition, and Bonnie's keys were nowhere to be found in her purse or the surrounding area. Detectives brought Michael Haim in for questioning. He maintained his story, claiming that Bonnie had simply walked out on him and their son. He denied having anything to do with her disappearance, but the police were highly skeptical. They went to the house on Delfiore Drive with search dogs and forensic teams. They searched the house, the backyard, and the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of Bonnie or any evidence of a struggle. But the problem was, they found absolutely nothing. There was no blood, no signs of violence, and no physical evidence of a crime. Without a body or physical evidence, they could not arrest Michael. But there was one witness to whatever had happened on the night of January 6. That witness was 3-year-old Aaron. After his mother disappeared, Aaron was placed in the care of relatives and then eventually into foster care. During this time, the young boy began talking to child protective workers, family members, and a child psychologist. What he said was chilling. Despite being only 3 years old, Aaron was very clear about what he had seen. He told a social worker that Daddy hurt Mommy, he said that Daddy shot Mommy, and that Mommy was sleeping. He even said that Daddy put Mommy in the water and that Daddy could not find his gun. When the child psychologist interviewed Aaron, the boy repeated these details with haunting consistency. He even drew pictures of what he described. The police were deeply disturbed by the boy's statements, and they tried to use them to build a case against Michael. And so, despite the boy's declarations, no charges were filed against Michael. In the years that followed, Michael fought a bitter custody battle. He wanted his son back, but Bonnie's family fought desperately to keep Aaron away from him, believing that Michael was a cold-blooded killer. Eventually, Aaron was placed in a foster home and was later adopted by a loving couple named the Fraziers. Aaron legally changed his last name to Frazier, trying to distance himself as much as possible from the biological father he despised and feared. Michael Haim eventually gave up, packed up his things, and moved away from Jacksonville, eventually settling in North Carolina. He rented out the house on Delfiore Drive to a series of tenants, and the property slowly began to fall into disrepair. The backyard swimming pool, once a place of family gatherings, became cracked, filled with stagnant water, dirt, and overgrown weeds. Fast forward to 2004. Aaron Frazier was no longer a helpless 3-year-old boy. He was a young man, and he had never forgotten his mother, nor had he ever wavered in his belief of what had happened to her. He decided to use the civil court system to seek some form of justice. Aaron Frazier filed a wrongful death lawsuit against his biological father, Michael Haim. It was a bold and difficult legal move, especially since Bonnie's body had still never been found. But Aaron was determined. The civil trial took place, and Aaron's legal team presented all the circumstantial evidence, including the car seat at the airport, the mud on the tires, Michael's controlling behavior, and Aaron's own childhood statements. In a civil court, the burden of proof is lower than in a criminal court, and the jury was thoroughly convinced. In 2005, the court ruled in Aaron's favor, awarding him a massive multi-million-dollar wrongful death judgment against Michael Haim. But Michael did not have millions of dollars in cash to pay his son. Instead, as part of the settlement and court orders to satisfy the judgment, the deed to the childhood home on Delfiore Drive was ordered to be transferred from Michael Haim to Aaron Frazier. It took several years for all the legal red tape to clear, but by 2014, the transfer was finally complete. At 24 years old, Aaron Frazier was officially the owner of the house where his mother had vanished 21 years earlier. For Aaron, this property was not a nostalgic or happy place. He had not lived there since he was 3 years old, and the handful of memories he had from being in that house were basically all bad. It was a place of loud fights, fear, and the sudden traumatic loss of his mother. But now that he owned the property, he decided he wanted to do something productive with it. He wanted to completely renovate the house and the yard, turning a place of tragedy into a beautiful home where he could perhaps start his own family or sell it for a fresh start. He decided the best place to start his renovations was the backyard. In December of 2014, Aaron rented a large excavator to begin the demolition work. The backyard was dominated by the old concrete swimming pool, which was now an eyesore and completely unusable. Aaron climbed into the driver's seat of the excavator, pulled the safety bar down, and started the loud diesel engine. He gripped the control levers, feeling the heavy vibration of the machine. He pushed the lever forward, and the massive metal bucket dipped down, cutting into the thick slab of concrete surrounding the pool. Debris went flying everywhere, and Aaron felt a deep sense of satisfaction. There was something incredibly therapeutic about tearing down the physical remnants of his painful past. He pressed the lever again, ripping off another chunk of concrete, watching the old pool crumble into pieces. By early afternoon, Aaron had successfully demolished and cleared out the pool. He then swung the excavator's bucket over to the outdoor shower area, which was located right next to where the pool had been. He dug the bucket deep into the concrete base of the shower and pulled back. But as soon as the bucket ripped through the concrete, a massive geyser of water shot high into the sky. Aaron winced, immediately realizing he had struck an active underground water line. Aaron quickly shut down the excavator, jumped out of the cab, and ran to turn off the main water valve to the property. Once the rushing water subsided and turned into a slow trickle, Aaron grabbed a shovel from his truck and walked back over to the muddy mess. He needed to dig down by hand to see how badly the pipe was. With his shovel, Aaron began carefully scooping away the wet mud and broken pieces of concrete. He worked methodically, digging deeper into the earth. At some point, the metal blade of his shovel struck something rigid and plastic. It made a dull, thudding sound. Aaron stopped and peered into the hole. At first, it looked like a common plastic trash bag, but when he cleared more dirt away, he realized the material was too thick and tough to be a simple trash bag. It was heavy-duty, industrial-grade plastic sheeting, the kind used in major construction projects. Aaron was curious. Why would someone bury thick construction plastic deep underneath the concrete slab of an outdoor shower? He used the tip of his shovel to pierce the tough plastic, and then he put the shovel down. He got down on his knees in the mud and began peeling away the dirty plastic sheeting with his bare hands. As he pulled the layers back, he realized the plastic was wrapped tightly and securely around some sort of bulky, rounded object. He continued to tear the plastic away, and finally, he revealed the object hidden inside. It was a brown, fibrous, rounded object. It looked exactly like an old, weathered coconut. Aaron reached down, picked the object up out of the mud, and stood up. He held it in his hands, staring at it in complete confusion. He wondered why on earth anyone would take the time to wrap a single coconut in waterproof industrial plastic and bury it deep under a concrete shower slab. It made absolutely no sense. As Aaron stood there in the quiet backyard, rotating the heavy, rounded object in his hands, trying to make sense of the strange find, he turned it around to see the other side. And when he saw the back of this supposed coconut, his heart stopped and he let out a terrifying scream. The object in his hands was not a coconut at all. It was a human skull, and because of the distinctive shape, the location, and everything he had known deep in his heart for 21 years, Aaron knew instantly whose skull he was holding. He was holding the remains of his mother, Bonnie Haim. He just hadn't realized it until he rotated the object and looked directly into her empty eye sockets and saw her teeth. Aaron dropped the skull in shock and immediately dialed 911. Within minutes, the Delfiore Drive property was flooded with police officers, forensic investigators, and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. This was the same police department that had investigated Bonnie's disappearance back in 1993, and many of the older detectives on the force had never forgotten the case of the missing young mother and the 3-year-old boy who told them his daddy did it. Forensic teams set up tents over the backyard and began a meticulous, slow excavation of the entire area around the outdoor shower. Over the next several days, they carefully uncovered the rest of the skeletal remains that had been buried under the concrete for more than 2 decades. The skeleton was remarkably preserved because of the thick plastic wrapping. As the forensic pathologists examined the remains and the dirt surrounding them, they made a critical discovery. Lying in the mud right next to the skeleton was a spent .22 caliber bullet casing. The medical examiner in Jacksonville officially identified the remains as Bonnie Haim through DNA testing. They also determined that her cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The discovery of the skull, the skeleton, and the .22 caliber bullet casing completely shattered Michael Haim's 21-year-old lie that Bonnie had simply walked out on her family and run away. It turned out that on the night of January 6, 1993, when Bonnie was on the phone with her friend Even, Michael had indeed walked in and confronted her. The argument escalated quickly and violently. Michael, furious that Bonnie was planning to leave him and take their son, retrieved his .22 caliber rifle. In front of their 3-year-old son, Michael shot and killed Bonnie. But Michael did not panic. He was a construction worker and he knew exactly how to hide a body. He wrapped Bonnie's body in heavy industrial plastic sheeting from his work inventory. He then carried her out to the backyard where he dug a deep grave right next to the swimming pool. He placed her wrapped body inside and covered it with dirt. To ensure that nobody would ever dig there and to completely seal the grave, he poured a thick slab of concrete over the spot, constructing an outdoor shower on top of it. He believed that by putting a permanent concrete structure over her resting place, her body would never be found. The next morning, Michael staged the scene to make it look like Bonnie had fled. He took her car, drove it to the airport, and parked it in the lot, pushing the seat back so that if anyone looked, they might assume a different driver or that she had driven it herself and then left. He tossed her purse into a dumpster near the hotel to make it look like she was discarding her old life. But he made a few critical mistakes. He forgot to adjust the driver's seat back to Bonnie's height, and he drove through mud on his way back, leaving a clear forensic trail on the tires. And of course, his biggest mistake was assuming his son would forget. But Aaron did not forget. His words, that Daddy shot Mommy and put her in the water, were completely accurate. The outdoor shower was right next to the pool, and Aaron had likely seen his father digging and working near the water lines. With the physical remains found, the .22 caliber bullet recovered, and the forensic evidence matching the rifle Michael Haim owned, the police finally had the hard evidence they needed. In 2015, Michael Haim was arrested at his home in North Carolina and extradited back to Jacksonville, Florida, to face charges for the murder of his wife. The trial took place in April of 2019. It was an incredibly emotional and highly publicized trial. The star witness for the prosecution was none other than Aaron Frazier. Now a grown man, Aaron stood on the witness stand, looked directly at his biological father, and recounted the painful memories of his childhood, the search for his mother, and the shocking moment he uncovered her skull in the backyard of his childhood home. The defense tried to argue that there was no proof of how Bonnie died, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. Michael Haim, who had lived as a free man for more than 26 years after brutally murdering his wife, was sentenced to life in prison. For Aaron, the verdict brought a profound sense of relief and justice, but the emotional scars of his childhood will never truly heal. He had spent his entire life carrying the burden of a truth that no one would believe, only to literally dig up that truth with his own hands in the very yard where he once played. But the story of Aaron Frazier is not the only time a sudden discovery turned a cold case completely on its head. Sometimes the search for a missing person takes a turn so bizarre that it seems almost impossible to believe. And that brings us to the summer of 2012 in the beautiful, rugged landscape of southern Iceland. Around lunchtime on August 25, 2012, a young woman named Grace was standing in a public restroom in front of a mirror, carefully applying her makeup. She was in the middle of a solo bus tour across the country, and after days of dusty roads and long hours of travel, she was feeling tired and a little bit disheveled. The tour bus she was on made regular pit stops at various scenic locations, and today they had pulled over near Eldga, which is the largest volcanic canyon in the world. Typically, these stops were meant for the tourists to stretch their legs, eat some lunch, and hike around to take in the breathtaking views. But on this particular afternoon, Grace didn't feel like hiking. She wanted to use this break to freshen up and make herself feel clean again. While Grace was inside the restroom, someone knocked on the door. She quickly called out an apology, but she didn't rush. She finished putting on her eyeliner, took her hair down, and then tied it back up into a tight, high ponytail. She also decided to change her clothes. She took off the dark, heavy sweatshirt she had been wearing all morning and stuffed it into her backpack, pulling out a fresh, light-colored shirt instead. Her backpack itself was a light, cream-colored bag, which she slung over her shoulder. Once she was done, she stepped out of the restroom and into the gravel parking lot. Across the lot, she saw her tour bus idling, and several other members of her group were already boarding. Grace walked quickly across the gravel, stepped onto the bus, and slid back into her window seat. A few minutes later, the bus driver stood up at the front of the cabin to perform his standard head count. This was a routine procedure he did at every single stop to ensure that no tourists were left behind in the remote Icelandic wilderness. Normally, Grace paid absolutely no attention to this. She would just look out the window, listening to music or reading, but today she noticed that the driver was taking a really long time. He walked up and down the aisle, mumbling to himself, counting again and again. He looked visibly stressed. Finally, he turned to the passengers and announced that they could not leave because a member of their tour group was missing. The group decided to wait on the bus, hoping the missing person would wander back soon. But after an hour of waiting with no sign of anyone, the driver grew seriously concerned and called the police. Eldga is a massive, deep canyon with steep volcanic walls and treacherous debris at the bottom. It is incredibly easy for an inexperienced hiker to lose their footing, slip into a crevice, or get completely disoriented. In the harsh Icelandic climate, being lost in a canyon like this could quickly become a life-or-death situation. When the police and local search and rescue teams arrived, they immediately set up a command center and began interviewing the tourists on the bus to get a description of the missing person. Some of the passengers recalled seeing a young woman of Asian descent who had been wearing a dark sweatshirt and carrying a light-colored bag. They remembered her leaving the bus at the start of the lunch break, but they hadn't seen her return. Now, Grace was of Asian descent, but she had not personally paid attention to who was on or off the bus. When the police asked for volunteers to help search the area, Grace, being a kind and civic-minded person, immediately agreed. She wanted to do her part to help find this poor, lost tourist. For the next 15 hours, Grace and dozens of other searchers scoured the massive canyon. She was grouped with another tourist and a professional search and rescue officer. They walked in a strict grid pattern, scanning the rocky terrain, calling out into the wind. As evening turned to night, the search grew more intense. The Icelandic authorities called in additional rescue personnel and a helicopter equipped with powerful searchlights. The canyon was filled with the deafening roar of the helicopter blades and the sweeping beams of white light cutting through the darkness. The search went on all through the night, but by 3 a.m. there was still absolutely no sign of the missing woman. Exhausted, shivering, and barely able to keep her eyes open, Grace finally decided to take a break. She walked back to the parked tour bus, intending to get a few hours of sleep before the search resumed at dawn. She sat down in her seat and opened her light-colored backpack to grab some makeup wipes to clean her face. But as she reached into the bag, her fingers brushed against the fabric of her old, dark sweatshirt. She froze. She pulled the sweatshirt out of her bag and stared at it. Then she looked down at her light-colored backpack. She thought about the description of the missing tourist. A young woman of Asian descent, wearing a dark sweatshirt, carrying a light-colored bag. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The missing tourist they had been desperately searching for, the person she had spent the last 15 hours looking for in the freezing cold canyon, was her. It turned out that a series of minor, completely innocent mistakes had snowballed into a massive, multi-agency search operation. First, earlier that morning, before they even arrived at the canyon, the bus driver had made an error during his head count. He had accidentally counted one extra person who wasn't actually there. So, when he did his head count at Elja and came up one short, he assumed someone was missing, when in reality, everyone was accounted for. Second, when the other passengers described the woman who had left the bus, their description was technically correct. She was of Asian descent, wearing a dark sweatshirt and carrying a light bag. But because Grace had gone into the restroom, changed her clothes, put her hair up in a ponytail, and applied makeup, she looked completely different when she got back on the bus. Nobody recognized her as the same woman. And Grace, completely unaware of the driver's head count error, had no idea they were looking for her. Embarrassed but relieved, Grace immediately walked over to the bus driver and the search coordinators and explained the mix-up. She walked straight up to them with the sweatshirt in her hands. The search was called off, and the rescue teams, though tired, were incredibly relieved that the missing tourist was safe and sound, even if she had been helping them search for herself the entire night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, Sierra Tare woman vanished without a trace, until her own son dug up the truth 21 years later. In 1993, Bonnie Haim disappeared from her Florida home, leaving behind a 3-year-old son who kept saying, "Daddy hurt Mommy." Police found her car at the airport, but the seat was pushed back too far for Bonnie to drive and the tires were covered in strange mud. Her husband Michael claimed she ran away, but no one believed she would abandon her child. The twist? Years later, her son Aaron inherited the house and began renovating the backyard. Under an old concrete shower, he found a skull wrapped in plastic. It was Bonnie. That discovery finally exposed Michael's secret and sent him to prison for life. Watch the full story on our channel.